You're listening to the Palladian Park podcast. This show and our website, palladianpark.com, are designed to improve thinking and communication skills. Your hosts are the co-founders of Palladian Park, Jenna Shaw and Collin Wheeler. Together, they explore the vastness of intellectual curiosities in the world. Like and subscribe to this show to never miss a new episode. Although we are consultants, we are not consulting you through this podcast. All information shared in this podcast is intended to be informative and entertaining in nature. While we make every effort to make sure topics discussed on this podcast are accurate, they may be incomplete or changing in nature. All views and opinions expressed in this podcast by participants are solely their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions of Palladian Park. Hello, and welcome to the Palladian Park podcast. My name's Jenna, and I'm here with Collin, as always, and we're here to talk about our monthly newsletter for January 2021. It's hard to believe we're in 2021, huh, Collin?
It is. Hopefully 2021 is better than 2020, but as of this recording, it's off to a little bit of a rocky start.
Yeah, I know. I think everyone was hoping that, and now maybe only January. Hopefully February will get a little bit better, so... But in this podcast, we're basically going to review our January newsletter, so things from our blog, what we're exploring, what we're reading, and what we're thinking about. So with that, I think Colin's going to talk about some merch.
Yeah, so we'll just start out at the very top of the newsletter, and as always, we have our link to our store there and logo merchandise, so do invite you to check that out. And then the next page, we're talking about a podcast that we recorded previously, which is about a newsletter that we did in October. So the podcasts do lag the newsletters. So if you prefer listening to the newsletter rather than reading it, that is an option as well. And you can find that on wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, Google, Anchor, and so on.
Perfect. So from there, we're going to talk about what's from our blog real quickly. So our latest blog post is Hanlon's Razor, Don't Assume the Worst. This is one of the mental models that was in our overview post that's gone more in depth. And basically with Hanlon's Razor, the whole gist of it is never attribute to malice, which can be adequately explained by neglect. So if you would like, that's in our newsletter. There's also a link to palladianpark.com where you can read that blog post in its entirety. Also, we're going to have a future podcast episode where Collin and I discuss this blog post in more detail. So that'll be forthcoming.
Yeah, so with that, we can keep moving right along into the next section, which is the exploration section. And so we really only picked one topic for this newsletter, and it concerns history. And so the first one, which hopefully it kind of piques your interest because it piqued ours, it says, what did the past smell like? Which is a fascinating question in and of itself, and I don't think many people would really give much consideration to it. I think the smell doesn't really change that much over time. But maybe it does. And so anyways, what we are exploring in this is that, history and how it's described to us, it's either done by word of mouth, done by books, it's done by documentaries, movies, could have audiobooks or something like that. So, but really what that is it's a representation of what happened in the past, and it's not identical. You can't make it identical. And so we call it a map, not the territory, which is one of our mental models that we've talked about briefly in the past, and we'll take a deep dive into it in the future because it is a really fascinating concept. But really, what history is and how we internalize it is heavily influenced by the medium through which we consume it. And so the ones that I was talking about, word of mouth, video, reading books, really the only senses that you're engaging there are your visual system, could be auditory system if you're hearing it from word of mouth, could be both if you have a movie, you're watching it and you're listening at the same time. But really, those are the only two senses that you're getting. And obviously, we have more than just those two senses. And that's how we engage with and experience the world, is through touch and smell and seeing and hearing. And so we use all of our senses rather than just a few. And so when we're thinking about what happened throughout history, we're only really using or able to consume history with a few senses. So it's a fragment. So, anyways, one of the fragments that's missing is smell, which incidentally, their smell has a huge impact on memory formation and memory recall and things like that, which is kind of funny because history, by definition, happened in the past. It's memories. So, anyways, there is a project that's going on. It's called Odoropa, and that group they're trying to recreate smells in like the Industrial Revolution, that kind of time frame in Europe. So they in the article that we link here, it kind of talks about we romanticize the past a little bit and kind of that time period. We say, oh, I wish men still wore suits and women still wore dresses, and the movies that we watch that kind of plays off of that, or even the books. So just a whole host of them. I won't go into specific details, but we have this kind of mental image in our minds. But if we were to think about the smells and stuff that was actually happening, so you're riding down the street in a horse and buggy, well, it's going to smell like horses. They had a whole bunch of coal in the inner cities and smog, and it was dirty. The sanitation wasn't great, so it likely wouldn't smell that great. So those are just a few examples of how we don't get the full picture from just looking at something. We see people dressed nicely and being mannerly and a different type of civilization or societal norms, anyways, than we have today. But it's not the full picture.
Yeah, I think that's what got me the most when we first talked about this was realizing that, as we all know, that smell is the strongest indicator of memory. Like it brings back memories the most, and realizing that in history it's so underrepresented. Like it's so hard to document that, like you said before, and that even in written word, so much is talked about how things look, but it feels like the descriptions usually aren't as often about what it smells like. And then like also it falls short because it's such a visceral sensation where it's a little bit easier to imagine in your brain the looks than the smell. And so when you talked about this, it was so fascinating because I hadn't really considered it, that it's such a missing part, but it can transport you to a time and place so quickly, the smell. But yeah, it's so, we love history, but I so hadn't thought of it that way before.
Yeah, for sure. And it will be interesting to see, how we keep progressing with technology and trying to make better map. But there's always a downside to it. The more detailed a map is, the harder it is to read, or the longer it takes to read it. Plus, if it's too detailed, people think it's a replica, and it's really just a representation. So give and take.
Yep.
But anyways, that was the first article on what did the past smell like, and so we have that link to it's a Nautilus article. Do check that out. And the second article is called "The Five Lessons of History," and it's from the blog of Collaborative Fund, which is a investor. And Morgan Housel actually wrote this. He's an author. He's written many books, and he's a very good author too. So anyways, it's a short blog post, and I like at the very beginning how he kind of distinguishes these two different types of history from which we can learn. And so to quote him, and I abbreviated a little bit here, it says there are two kinds of history to learn from. The first one is the specific events, but their usefulness is limited. And then the second kind of history to learn from are the broad behaviors that show up again and again in multiple fields in different eras. Those broad lessons are important because we know they'll be relevant in the future. So it's kind of this prescriptive versus descriptive thing that, Jenna, we haven't mentioned on the podcast before, but in some of our Palladian Park meetings and stuff, we've talked about this and its applicability to a whole host of things. But I think specifically we talked about the map is not the territory, which again we'll take a deep dive into the future. We want to really get that one right.
Yeah,
But
it's an
anyways,
important one.
yeah, yep. But anyways, it is interesting. It's also kind of along the lines of, or at least some crossover between the concept of giving someone a fish versus teaching them to fish.
For sure.
Yeah, the first one, specific events, that is you are getting the fish. So the usefulness is limited. It's good for one meal. But then if you're taught how to fish, that's the second kind where you notice these patterns, these repetitions, these or principles, or as he calls in the blog post, lessons, to where you can actually benefit from it for yourself time and time again.
Yeah. You could almost tie it in a little bit maybe not exactly, but into finite versus infinite game idea too, of saying like in this moment, which is kind of similar to, like you said, getting the fish versus learning the fish, of like, the short ones in the moment, the specific moment is the finite game, but in the infinite game, it's much better to have the broad strokes and understand, what keeps happening over and over. So you're really understanding the game that you're in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is applicable. So, going through the lessons here really quickly. The first one is calm plants the seeds of crazy. So it's kind of like the calm before the storm, and when you try to make everything safe, sometimes it gets more dangerous because people don't consider all of the dangers that are actually there. They think it's a completely sterile environment when it's not.
Also, you could say, because I feel like human brains, it's like we're always, the ideal is like straddling the line between order and chaos. And so anytime you could also say of like if it's too calm, if there's too much order, it's kind of why the utopian ideal fails, because it's like we're animals at heart, like we need something going on. So if a lot of people claim, and I think there's some truth to it, that if we're too orderly or too calm, like people just start breaking shit to make it happen, like to make it interesting. Because if it's we're not meant to be totally subdued and calm all the time. So I think it's something along those lines too. You could
For sure.
One could argue.
For sure. Yeah. Lesson 2 is progress requires optimism and pessimism to exist. I don't know if there's much more to say on that one. It's
Nope.
you have to be optimistic to keep pushing the envelope, but pessimist enough to not go off the rails.
To be realistic.
Right.
Yep. It's definitely, as we say all the time, balance of all things. Perfect example.
Balance of all things. Yep. That should be a lesson on here.
Definitely.
Lesson number 3 is people believe what they want to believe, see what they want to see, and hear what they want to hear.
Hmm.
And go to our biases post for more there.
Yeah. It reminds me of that one video, the study they did of the gorillas, where you go and they tell people to count how many passes go between all the people, and then a man in a gorilla suit comes right in the middle of the frame, and a big majority of people don't notice it because they're so focused on the task, which is like a crazy, when you really think, it seems silly at first when you see the video because you're like, oh my god, but it has a big implication of, oh, you see what you aim at, like you really see what you want to see, what you're focused on. And so it definitely, I think, ties into this too, where it's like scientific backing for what this is saying. Same thing.
Right, right, definitely. And it kind of plays into, we haven't talked about this before, but the backfire effect, where even when you have a strongly held belief, and even when you are presented evidence to the contrary of your belief, instead of lightening your belief or even staying constant, you actually dig in more and you believe in whatever it is that you believed in to a
Yeah.
stronger degree.
You would throw in some confirmation bias there too.
For sure. There's a yeah, pretty good way of him to summarize a whole host of cognitive biases and different things that go into making this a real phenomenon for us.
Hmm.
Lesson number 4, important things rarely have one cause.
Can't add much more. It's pretty straightforward. I
It's
think
pretty
spot on.
straightforward. hmm And then lesson number 5, Jenna, we had a pretty good discussion about this. Risk is what you don't see.
Hmm. I like that. I think it's a unique way of thinking about it. Or it's not like my default way of thinking about risk, because I think a lot of people do, but I like that. It's a different way of a different perspective of looking at risk that way, which I think is a great way of thinking about it.
hmm Yeah, there's a ton of applicability here in the investment industry where you're trying to identify a good investment. And basically, one of the ways to do that is you invert it and you try to avoid all the ones that are going to be bad. And it gets kind of into our circle of competence mental model, where within your circle of competence, it doesn't really matter how big that is, but if you stay in there, you are much less likely to be blindsided by something because that's your expertise. You know everything in there like the back of your hand. And then when you venture outside of your circle of competence, there's a lot of stuff that can pop up that you might not even be aware of. That you do one thing, and it is linked to a whole bunch of other things like dominoes, but you can't see it happening until it comes back around to one that gets you. That is really important because it's not quite enough to just identify if something is risky or not based on what can happen that you know of. known and unknown risks. And this one is mainly talking about the unknown.
Hmm.
Those are the ones that will get you.
Yeah, because you're not prepared and can't plan for them if you don't see them.
Yep. So yeah, that was what we explored, the lessons of history and what did the past smell like. So
Sweet.
it was pretty fascinating. If you don't have anything else, we can jump into your first book.
Let's do it. So, yeah, we're going to talk about some books. So the first one we're going to talk about is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, written by Carson Cullers. This is her debut novel, and she wrote it when she was 23. No, I think it was actually published when she was 23. So this novel was published when she was 23, and as I was reading it, her writing is just brilliant and great, and I found that out, and I made me kind of mad that she was that good. And I think a lot of people consider it one of the most stunning debut novels ever written. I think I wrote that actually in the newsletter. Yeah, I did. And so it was published in 1940, and it illuminates American society at the time. But it also is a timeless representation of the forgotten, the rejected, and the oppressed margins of society. And so basically, it's this story of a deaf mute, and then all these cast of characters that befriend him. Basically, it's a 14-year-old girl, an aging intellectual doctor, an alcoholic drifter, and a restaurant owner. And they all become friends with him, and it's basically how their paths cross and how their lonely hearts intersect. And so it's a wonderful novel. She just really gets humanity. It feels like there's so many. There's a few quotes I'll go over here, but there's so many in this book that you could talk about because it just feels like she sees humanity and has great insight and hits the nail on the head. Let's see here. So a few of my favorite is the most fatal thing a man can do is try to stand alone. It's very simple, but very spot on. And a lot of profound things don't necessarily have to be complex, but it's definitely a good one. And then, yeah, and another quote is, "How can the dead be truly dead when they still live in the souls of those who are left behind?" It's a nice other one. There's a lot of other really good ones that are really long I won't go over, but highly recommend. And this book really gets you thinking about, at least for me, what it reminded me of is like how complex and beautiful the human spirit is, and how often we get distracted from what's on the surface. Because when you're looking at these like characters, they seem to have nothing in common, but they have this deaf mute that they kind of project their loneliness onto and their friendship onto him. And then, but when they all get in a room together, they don't connect. They get distracted by the color of their skin and their different ages and different backgrounds. And really, though, the more you read about them, you see that they have so much in common, but they can't see it. And so, yeah, it kind of reminded me of like, often the best stuff is underneath, and deep connections are often made in the most unexpected places. So if you just good reminder to bother to look a little deeper and see the people around you.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. And I agree with you on when she was like 21 or 22 when she wrote this. And yeah, what
It's annoying in the best
what
way.
yeah, what am I doing with my
Yeah,
life?
just like dang.
Not that we should compare, but
Still, it's impressive.
yep, yep. Okay, well, I think I will go into mine now, which is called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. This is by Lawrence Gonzalez, and it's a super, super fascinating book where he really dives into what does it mean to be a survivor? What is surviving? And so he gets into a whole bunch of psychology, biology, evolutionary traits, history, even addiction. So really, the breadth in this book is really fascinating. But he's combining a whole bunch of research with narrative, so it's like this wonderfully interwoven book of story and research. So it's super entertaining to read, and you learn a lot from it as well. So he had a whole bunch of really good quotes. Could have taken up in this entire newsletter, but I'll only read a couple here. The first one is about how some people, and this kind of gets into our non-binary thinking, or at least we try to, but how a lot of people kind of default to black and white, one or zero. And so one of those is you're either rational or you're emotional. And that's not the case at all. Human beings are emotional beings who think, not really rational beings who feel. And I'm generalizing here, but we have both. and because of our emotions, we behave certain ways, and we've survived this far because of them. So they do have some usefulness, but they also do have some downfall as well. So, anyways, the first quote says Plato understood that emotions could trump reason, and that to succeed, we have to use the reins of reason on the horse of emotion. That turns out to be remarkably close to what modern research has begun to show us, and it works both ways. The intellect without the emotion is like the jockey without the horse. And so, really, really like that quote. How it's talking about how the importance of having both and being able to use both. And if you only have one, you're a horse, or you're a jockey without a horse, a horse without a jockey, or a jockey without a horse. So you're incomplete regardless of which one you have. But if you have both, then you can run the race well.
And we talk about that all the time, the importance
Hmm.
of the two and balancing the two.
Balance of all things.
Definitely.
And then another quote here says, and this one is a champion for multidisciplinary learning, which is what Palladian Park is all about. So it says, since the brain and its wiring appear to be the determining factor in survival, this is an argument for expanding and refining it. The more you have learned and experienced of art, music, poetry, literature, philosophy, mathematics, and so on, the more resources you will have to fall back on. And he's specifically talking about survival and high stakes situations, but really it applies to all sorts of areas of life, from just the work that you're doing to interacting with new people. The more that you've experienced of different disciplines and different lifestyles and different cultures, the more able or better able you are to connect with a much more diverse group of people, and so on and so on. So, really does speak to the importance of multidisciplinary learning.
It really is like, don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing.
Right.
And yeah, and we've talked about this one a lot. I think this book has, this sparked a lot of conversation in us and things that have carried on a lot. And that's one thing we talk a lot about. Of now it feels like we're in a world of a lot of specialization, and it's like multidisciplinary, like you were talking about, learning is great because not only is it resources for you to fall back on, but like you said, to connect with people, because it gives you a common language, and so it makes it easier to connect and connect deeper with more people, which kind of ties into what I was saying. The bringing fiction and nonfiction to no man can stand alone, or shouldn't. It's the same idea of like, you want to connect with people, you don't think about it necessarily, but if you learn more and have more discipline that way, it helps your intellect, but it also can help with the emotional side of connecting with people and having a way to communicate with them effectively and connect more.
Right. Yep. I think it's a good tie into our blog post, misperceptions of mutual exclusivity.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People think it's one way or the other, when in fact there are many middle roads that combine the two to different degrees.
And how that side, especially with like intellect and emotions, thinking like they work against each other. It's like, absolutely not. They work great together if you can harness them together, which we talk about a lot of, like, even in times when you talk about like feminism, or the toxic masculinity gets a lot of bad rap, and it's like these big bad things, like, no, but it hurts men too, because it's this unfortunate thing of intellect matters, rationality matters much more than emotions. It's like, oh no, balance of, but you need both, and it's helping it so it's like men and women both should be able to have both sides. Emotion shouldn't just be a woman thing, it's a human thing, and keeping those two in balance is good for all of us.
Yes, well said. All right, you want to do your last book?
Cool. Yeah, that's a great book. It was good to revisit it.
I really like that one.
Yeah, same. Even though I haven't read it, but through you I feel like I have a lot of the finer points. Cool. So the last book we're going to talk about is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which Colin and I have both read, but I've just read it a little bit more recently. Most likely, I feel like nowadays most people have at least heard of this or read some of the quotes because they're so iconic, but if not, it's basically the meditations of one of the world's most powerful men, Marcus Aurelius, who was, I think he was considered the last great emperor of the five great emperors, I think, of Rome. And so yeah, he was basically the biggest man of his time, like the most powerful man of his time. And it's his meditations are a series of him like he's challenging spiritual reflections and exercises in an attempt to understand himself and a sense of the world around him. It's a book full of Stoic wisdom and lots of great life advice, and it's quite astounding how applicable it is today. I would challenge anyone to read this and not have even a few, but it would probably be a ton of nuggets of wisdom that you carry on and are applicable right away. So it's still very accessible in modern times. And this is one, especially, we've said this for all of them, but I think this is probably the most true of this book, where you could almost underline or quote almost any one of these, because it's basically him listing out these meditations. And so these are just a few. And I picked a few of them that you don't see all the time, I think. I tried to, because there's a lot online. But like a big one people talk about a lot is the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That's a very common one. Another one I like, though, because he easily gets to a lot of Stoicism. Feels like sometimes people say, you're a statue, you don't feel. And there's a lot of great emotion things he talks about. Like one of them is wash yourself clean with simplicity, with humility, with indifference to everything but right and wrong, care for other human beings. And so when you read it through, there's a lot of that he talks about seeing the beauty in the world. And another one I liked is the world's intelligence is not selfish. That's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
It really speaks to abundance, where in modern times it feels like we're very much focused in scarcity. It's more that I think the society has made us feel scarcity, not that people naturally are. It's just advertising and to sell things. It's better to come from a scarcity place to sell more things. But that's a nice, optimistic, pithy little statement.
Right. And I really like that one. It makes me think about the idea about passing on a flame. You have a candle and you can light a bunch of other candles and it becomes this exponential event where then they do too. So it's not scarce. It's not finite, really. I mean, obviously to a certain degree, yes. But yeah, intelligence is something that can be passed along and can be grown. And not only is it just that you have a flame and you're passing it on to somebody else, your flame can get bigger by the passing it on to somebody else, because they can pass some back to you from what they know. Because I forget who said this quote, but everyone that you meet knows something that you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a fantastic opportunity to learn, as long as we approach those situations that way, open minded and understanding that this person has experiences in life, even though you might think of them as like if they didn't go to college and you did, and you have a master's or a PhD or higher level, doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. They just know things. They have different life experiences than you have,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. You guys are smart in different areas.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point and a great visual. I really like that, of passing the fire between you, and that idea of, the humility, which he talks about, like before where you're saying have humility. I think that's the ultimate humility, is approaching everybody like they have something to teach you, regardless of status. And I think anyone that's really been out in the world and really with their eyes wide open and tried to observe it, and I think we both came to this realization very early on, and it's just grown of, oh, education and credentials and all these things they're an indicator, but it's that map is not the territory, where that doesn't equal intellect. Just because someone has a degree or, is a certain age, or none of that is indicative. There might be correlations between, someone that has an education corollary maybe has a higher intelligence level, but it's not definitive at all. There's a lot of people that have not gone to school that have so much to teach us and know so much more than we do. And there's so many different kinds of intellect, as we talk about. But yeah, I like that feeling of, it feels like it's almost infectious or contagious in that way, which is kind of when you really start getting discourse with people and talking, that's how it should feel, right? Even if maybe I have more to teach you than you do me, we both learn. And even when you're teaching someone, right, that's like the best way to learn, because it really shows you what you know. And so it's this great back and forth.
Absolutely. It's a great book. I've read it twice, and it's been a couple years since I've read it, so it should probably make its way onto my nightstand again. Okay. Anything else on meditations?
I don't think so. I think that wraps it up.
Alrighty. Then we can move into the final part, what we were thinking about for this last month. This one is also an interesting thought, and it's entitled "Why We Judge People Based on Their Relatives." And so, kind of diving into this, it plays into, or kind of plays off of, rather, an article by Nautilus that we link in here. This is a common phenomenon where, if somebody in a family is a very far one wing or another of the political spectrum, to whether a little bit insufferable and stuff like that, you might think that the rest of the family is that way. Or if they have really strong religious beliefs, you might think that everybody in the family has really strong religious beliefs, which may or may not be the case. There sometimes it works, But really, what it is, it's an assumption. You're making an inference. Anyways, so we kind of dive into that a little bit. And so first off, we were talking about, okay, why is it that we even do it in the first place? And so the obvious answer we think is that, your family has a profound impact on who you become. There are two factors really that play into who you become: nature and nurture. And your family is a big factor in both of those. Your parents pass down their genes and the genes of your ancestors onto you, and those genes largely determine your skin color, eye color, height, ability to put on muscle or health. If maybe cancer or diabetes runs in your family, mental capabilities, maybe certain mental diseases or something run in your family too. So really, the nature part is huge in the molding of who you become. But then also, typically, the nurture part, typically you gonna live with your family in the first 18 years of your life, which are very formidable years. So obviously, school, your friends, teachers, and if you play instruments, your band or symphony musician friends. If you play sports, your teammates, your coach, they'll obviously have an impact on you as well, but you're spending a majority of your time with your family day in and day out, and so then they have a really big impact on you there too. Those are two reasons why your family really plays a big impact on who you are. So if you behave a certain way, it's likely that it's because you got it from your family. Yeah, if you go to school and you meet somebody and they behave a certain way, and then, or even if you're a teacher and one of your kids acts a certain way and talks about stuff a certain way, then at parent teacher conferences you have a preconceived notion of what their parents are going to act like, right or wrong. But anyways, that's just because we are inference machines and we have to. But anyways, so that was kind of our initial thoughts, and then we jumped into the article a little bit. Well, before we jump in the article, Jenna, is there anything on the initial thoughts that I left out?
No, I think I like how it says we're inference machines because that's what the way I think about it is that it's just it's our default setting because our brain, it's like the world is so complex, it's just always trying to simplify it down to make it, what's the word, understandable or like somewhat coherent for us. And so it's definitely the map's not the territory where it's not the actual world, but we have to simplify it. And so path of least resistance is in most things what our brain does is looking for shortcuts and ways to make inferences and things like that. And so it's just with this, it's not a way of being like, how dare you judge people? It's like, no, it's just a human thing to know for yourself. Like this is what we naturally do. And so that you can kind of say, oh, first thought's usually not best thought, where it could be valid, but like look further into that, assumption about people and their parents and or their family, anyone in their family.
Right. Yep. When we dive into the Nautilus article, they had this really fascinating example of just how pervasive this was throughout history, and I mean even to this day. But they're talking about in history and how we used our judgment on families for a sense of governance, and talking about royalty here, where obviously you don't have elections or anything; it's passed down through blood and sometimes war. But anyways, to quote it, it says one of the most common systems of governance in human evolutionary history was some form of hereditary rule, where the eldest son of a king, say, takes over after the king dies. Intuitive behavioral genetics, which is what they call making inferences or judgments about somebody based on their family. Intuitive behavioral genetics may have granted hereditary rule some sense of legitimacy. You might infer that if someone was a good and competent leader, there would be a pretty good chance that their close relatives, like their children, who have 50% of their genes, would also be good leaders. And if you know how to cope with one leader's personality problem, you could perhaps better cope under the rule of one of their close relatives. So that kind of plays into status quo bias and maybe a little bit of loss aversion too, but really status quo, where it's like we're familiar with this. We know this song and dance. We don't like change. This isn't that bad, and if something were to change, then it could get worse. So yeah, really fascinating way to think of it. Just how this tendency plays into more than just like the parent teacher conferences that I was talking about, at literal governance of countries and city states.
Well, and it shows where it fails, right? It's like you said, it's not always right or wrong. It's not the way to look at it, because like sometimes your inferences are correct, but it's clear when you look at history of monarchies and of royal families that a good leader does not mean their kid's going to be a good, it's the same thing of like great basketball players. It doesn't mean that their son or daughter is going to be great. It's kind of a luck of the draw where like there have been some terrible ones. There's one people that take after their, even Marcus Aurelius, his son, I forget his name now. He was not good at all. And he didn't care and he didn't want to be a leader when Marcus Aurelius is considered one of the best. So it is interesting how we use it to navigate, but then it can lead us astray at times too. But the good side is that I feel like we talk about this a lot. It's so fun to meet when you have new friends and you get to meet their parents, because it just informs you so much about them. And that's the kind of the flipping, inverting this in the good way, maybe, of saying it helps you understand them better, to see, oh, this little habit, or especially if you've like lived, I'm thinking of in college when you live with people, and you meet their family or their parents, you go, oh my gosh, this little nuance or these things make sense. And so the flip side of that is it helps you, some of those positive inferences are seeing that it like gives you context for the people around you and allows you to see them more fully and be more patient and understanding of who they are.
Right. Yeah, and then also this can be spun negatively too.
Uh-huh.
And we talk about this a little bit here. It's about, whenever you have a political election or something, you're oftentimes one party is trying to discredit their opponent. And sometimes they do this through attacking the character of that candidate, but then also directly, but then also indirectly through their affiliation with their family and whatever their family may or may not have done.
Yeah.
And since the 2020 election wasn't that long ago, we could use that for examples. Both the Trump families and the Trump family and Biden family were heavily scrutinized by both sides to try to show the incompetence or supposed untrustworthiness of the candidate based solely on what it was that their family has done.
Yeah. And
So,
you could tie that into multiple fallacies that we talked about in our fallacy blog post, a little red herring, a little of just like diverting the point of attacking the person's character versus their character, or their family's character versus their actual candidate and all
mhm,
that. So,
right.
but yeah, that's a great point. It was on both sides, because it's easy people to say one side or the other. It's like you're completely spot on, where it was definitely both.
Hmm.
And a lot of the criticisms were warranted, whether or not that should have affected the election, but that's a different matter. But
Yeah. And I think in the Nautilus article, it talks about how I think it was Clinton's brother. Don't now I'm forgetting. Don't quote me. Read it. But I believe he had a drug problem, and so then that makes you think about, well, what does that mean about the president? I think they also talked about a few other presidents in the past and what their family members have done, that ultimately that president and other members of the family tried to keep the unruly family member out of the press, out of the news stories, trying to keep them quiet. Otherwise, it would cause a lot of problems for the family, not only because it's just sensational subject, but also because you are then able to cast doubts upon the current leader.
which is kind of, when you really think about it, is kind of crazy. Like, that's true, but the fact that like someone related to be, people have like, fractured relationships with siblings and other things, and it could be someone that is so different from you and you haven't talked to in forever, but they can do that to you. It's quite crazy when you actually stop and think about like, oh yeah, that is crazy. It also made me think of, there were studies they did with, I think it was with identical twins, and it was with, I believe it was parents that had alcohol problems, and maybe some of it was drug problems, like alcoholics, and they found that it was almost like 50-50, where often one twin would follow down the path of, it might not have only been dad, I shouldn't say dads, that's sexist, dads and mom, I think it was either parent, but they basically, half of them went down the same road and had problems with alcohol or substance abuse, and the other half what like blew back the opposite way and like had nothing to do with it, had a very clean, like saw what their parents did and didn't want to do it. But they found it was a pretty, I believe it was a pretty even split, and that kind of shows you where it's like you can't, twins are the perfect way to study that, where you go, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter, like it just, there's a weird nature nurture thing. You can't just say, oh, because your family did it, you're destined to do it. It's
Hmm.
much more complicated. We want to make it that simple, but unfortunately, it's not.
Right. Yep. Oh, another example that we have listed in here because I'm surrounded by teachers, and I know that a lot of people who read and listen to this are have a educational background as well. So probably hits close to home for them. But so say a teacher 1 year has really good students, star of the class, behaved, always helped out, homework turned in on time, and good grades, just overall good student. And then over the summer for next year, or maybe it's 2 years later, the teacher is going to have that student's sibling. Even if the teacher doesn't know anything about that sibling, they're probably thinking, okay, this, good. I have high expectations for this student because of his or her sibling that I previously had that was really good. And then conversely, if they had a really bad student a couple years later and they have their sibling, they're like, oh, great, this is going to be another rough year. So, which again could or could not be true, but inferences do exist for a reason, and sometimes those are, they do work.
Yeah. My sister star pupil loved her. Then I came along, was a nightmare. So they were all excited. They're like, cool, another Shaw kid's coming. And then I just obliterated it.
Yeah, if my brother or sister are listening, they probably have a few comments on that from me. I will stay mum. All right, continuing on this idea of what we're thinking about. We also have to think, and this ties into earlier what we were talking about. We see what we want to see,
Hmm.
or we see what we're looking for. And there's a quote by he was a scientist. I'm trying to remember what all. He's a politician. I think he was a banker too. John Lubbock. He's lived in like the 1800s. But anyways, he has a quote that says, "We what we see depends mainly on what we look for." And so, using known traits about a relative to make a judgment about somebody doesn't necessarily have a bad track record, but it's not a perfect one by any means. So sometimes our perception of something misconstrues what's actually there.
Yeah.
It kind of plays into the chicken or the egg conundrum, where which came first, and which one is the one that's actually relevant, which one is the one that's actually having the most influence here. And so is a person acting a certain way because we're expecting them to act that way based off of their relatives, or are they behaving a certain way because that's who they truly are? And if it is because they're behaving in a certain way because we're expecting them to, there is this tendency for people to act in accordance with how they're treated. So I forget exactly how the quote goes, but it's basically if you want people to act a certain way, treat them that way.
Yeah. Which it's like that self-fulfilling prophecy thing of like, and it's true where they've shown it time and again of if you treat someone like a criminal, they'll be like a criminal. They've done it with kids too, where they had two of the exact same demographic of kids, and they told the teachers one that were at a really high level and one was at a remedial level, and they were the same exact, income level, everything, and the one that was expected to perform at an elite level did. They've shown the same thing with like a lot of times the reason for so long women weren't showing as doing well as well in math and science is because teachers didn't expect them. Even a lot of it was not even consciously, right? It wasn't blatant misogyny or being like women are bad. It's just like the back of the mind assumption we have. And so if teachers don't expect you to do well, you won't, which is crazy when you think about it. The same thing with people where, yeah, it's like if you, and it works in any scenario of whatever you treat people like, what usually
Yeah.
you'll get.
Getting towards the end of this, we say ultimately we have to understand that our initial judgment is a heuristic, which basically a heuristic is just a shortcut.
Mhm.
It allows us to make an inference very quickly based on very little information. And that's part of the reason why humans have survived. We're not strong, we're not fast compared to other animals by any means. So if we can make a split decision really quickly and have a decision that comes out that keeps us alive, even if it wasn't the optimal option, it was good to have that split second decision just for survival mechanism. That's part of the reason why it's important. But we've kind of, I don't know, we've evolved into this world where that doesn't really apply quite so much, at least from a survival standpoint. And I'm talking about here in America. Obviously, not everywhere in the world is the same, but we we need to realize that our initial assumption is not a concrete fact. It is a very beginning. We need to kind of be aware of an anchoring bias too, to not be stuck to that initial point as well. And then after we've made our initial inference, we'll have more information coming in. And with each bit of information, we need to update our initial assumption, which is called Bayesian updating. I think a really good way of putting this that's not like mathematical or anything like that. It's just beautifully put. It's one of my favorite quotes in the world. It's from A Gentleman in Moscow, the book, and I'll read it here. It says, "After all, what can a first impression tell us about someone we've just met for a minute in the lobby of a hotel? For that matter, what can a first impression tell us about anyone? Why, no more than a chord can tell us about Beethoven or a brushstroke about Botticelli. By their very nature, human beings are so capricious, so complex, so delightfully contradictory that they deserve not only our consideration, but our reconsideration, and our unwavering determination to withhold our opinion until we have engaged with them in every possible setting at every possible hour."
Beautiful.
Favorite quote. I could read that every day.
So poetic and also so hits the nail on the head for people. The way I think about it is it's like proceed with caution and curiosity from your baseline assumptions of understand, like it might be useful in that moment, but yeah, be cautious that it's not the real thing and then just be open and curious. I think that helps with tethering too, because
Right.
you're just like expecting, oh, it's my first thought. There might be some merit, but it's not my best, it's not meant to be a big snapshot, it's just a tiny thing. So great. Well, with that, is there anything else?
No, I think that ends it for this newsletter.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for listening to our podcast episode about our January 2021 newsletter. If you don't already subscribe, feel free to go to palladiumpark.com and you can sign up for our newsletter there and also see any of our blog posts, or there's a whole host of wonderful things. You can see our reading lists, among others. So thank you so much. And I think we're out.